We probably, I saw you, Bill, might have a couple more from my crew running a little late. Is that everybody? Or Regina? Okay. Yeah. Hi, Chi. I'll have one more.
Oh, it's a lock. I got it. The lock in here. Consultant close the door. No, the lock is up. Oh, I got it. So it's a lock. Hit the electric. I get it. Okay. I check.
Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody to our Cahokia Archaeological Society meeting. We do meet here the third Thursday of each month. Various types of programs and speakers, and if anybody's got a background and wants to do some speaking, that's fine. I'm Bill Weismayer, I'm the chairman of the committee that sets those up, and I am always looking for speakers. If you know someone else who's willing and able to do that, I appreciate it. Also, if you're not a member of our organization, we do have applications here, and our president and also semi-treasurer, Joanne here, can take those. Anybody who's interested in getting an application, raise your hand, and I'll pass one out to you. Okay. Everybody know some of you have been around before. A couple times. We'll just set them here at the front table over here. Interested, you can pick them up. Our speaker tonight is Autumn Melby from the University of Pennsylvania, obviously talking about Hawkins Hollow work that she's been doing. I don't know how long you're going to tell us all about that.
Yes, sir.
But she's also looking at areas where previous excavations have taken place, expanding on those. The late Mississippian little homestead, just a few houses apparently, but she's looking at how that relates to Cahokia and vice versa. And at the time that Cahokia was going into decline, and the relationship between the rural people and the city folk. So I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks so much. All right. Does this look like a good spot to stand? Perfect. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Really appreciate everybody coming out for this talk. I want to thank the Cahokia Archaeological Society for having me and Bill for the invitation. Like Bill said, my name is Autumn Melby. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, but I have been focusing my dissertation work here in the American Bottom, specifically on rural homestead household kind of sites, specifically more so in Monroe and Randolph County, one of which I want to talk about a good bit today, some of the background research that's led me to this point, and the current excavations that we're currently engaged in just right now. But before I jump into really the heart of the talk and nitty-gritty about Hawkins Hollow, I want to set the scene a little bit, so to speak, with a brief story. All right. So in early March 2020, Sedona will recall this story, I was taking part in a short excavation at the Poultry site near Dupo. This was going to be a quick little excavation to uncover a section of an early Mississippian house, just a week-long stint over spring break. It was still pretty viciously cold, and we were fighting consistent rainstorms and wind to try to get through our project goals. But working in the middle of a cornfield with no cell signal, and we hardly knew that the world around us was rapidly approaching a dramatic shift with the start of the COVID-19 lockdown. By midweek, we started receiving emails from our universities that in-person classes would be canceled for the next 2 weeks, at least, spring break extended. Research labs and student dorms, though, had 24-hour would be online classes, how we would figure that out. But the news shared stories of mad rushes to grocery stores, hospitals having no room for new patients, and predictions of supply chain shortages that would surely uproot the expected comforts of our everyday lives in pretty short order. So as we were hurrying to get back to our respective institutions and homes at the end of the week, life seemed to carry on pretty normal in the little towns that we passed through to and from the excavation site and worked near. There was no global news to tell us that these changes were occurring. We might not have known that anything had changed at all. Sure enough, though, as I got back to Philadelphia, I was greeted with eerily quiet streets, shuttered storefronts hoping to ward off any vandalism, and empty store shelves. I was on the phone with my mother and kind of trying to figure out why people needed to seemingly buy every roll of toilet paper in the city. And, in talking through this, she gave me a choice. I could either try to make things work in Philly without a clear end of lockdown necessarily in sight, or I could come back home to rural North Carolina. I could come home to the 2-acre farmhouse I grew up in a town population of really no more than about 1,300 people compared to Philadelphia's 1.6 million. It would only be for a few short months just for this to blow over, right? But for whatever reason, in that moment, rural North Carolina seemed much more secure, different than what my experience I expected would be if I stayed in Philadelphia. At the time, it seemed safer, more manageable, both physically and socially, during this massive societal shift we seemed to be approaching. I ended up living back in North Carolina with my parents for nearly a year while we rode the various waves of lockdown and COVID together. So why the heck am I telling this story? While I in no way want to suggest that the pre-contact city of Cahokia experienced any sort of widespread pandemic, this experience in particular really encouraged me to think seriously about the everyday lived experience of rural peoples and how it might differ in distinctive and meaningful ways from those of urban dwellers, particularly during these moments of broader societal change, whether that be a global pandemic or the collapse of a complex polity like Cahokia. How did rural peoples living beyond the central core of Cahokia's ceremonial center, or even its suburbs, actually engage with the decline and ultimate collapse of the Cahokian polity? Did their everyday lives shift in distinctive ways from their urban counterparts, or did they choose to maintain their established rhythms and routines? And what would these various potential changes or continued patterns suggest about how rural peoples viewed themselves and their broader social world during this pivotal time? So questions like this have guided the development of my dissertation research the last several years, and I'd like to share a bit of that with you all tonight. In particular, I'd really like to share updates about the current excavations I'm directing at the late Mississippian Hawkins Hollow Site near VALMEYER in Monroe County. This is a bit of an outline for kind of where we're going to be going tonight and how I'll be approaching this. I'll do a really brief kind of context setting of Cahokia and the American Bottom for any new visitors, as well as several students in my crew who are here tonight who are learning this region and its history really for the first time during this project. From here, I will discuss how I'm choosing to kind of engage with these bigger buzzword concepts like collapse, everyday life, rurality, what I'm trying to mean by these words. And then finally, from there, I'll dive into how I'm bringing all these ideas and methods of archaeology together for my dissertation project and the work that we've been doing at the Hawkins Hollow Site. But before I jump in, like I said, I want to kind of introduce myself a little bit. Like I said, I'm Autumn Melby, University of Pennsylvania. I got my Bachelor's of Science in Anthropology with a focus in archaeology and public history from Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina in spring of 2018. And I've been pursuing my PhD at Penn since fall of 2018. There we go. My incredible crew comes from a bit all over North Carolina, Texas. I have graduate students, undergrads, and recent graduates of Penn with me. Each of them are phenomenal scholars with research focusing all over from colonial maritime history of Virginia, lower Mississippi River Valley, and even the archaeology of like African diaspora in New Orleans. That said, despite this diversity, I'm really thankful I was able to convince them that this field season in particular would be worth their while. All right, so you're all good? All right, so diving into Cahokia and the broader American bottom itself. As many folks here know well, I am sure, Cahokia comprised the largest pre-contact concentration of people and monumental architecture north of Mexico, and was named the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. Now, though estimates will vary pretty wildly depending on who you ask, the city of Cahokia and its outlying settlements may have been home to as many as 50,000 people and at least kind of 20,000 or so at the most conservative estimates. And it probably would have taken more than a day to just traverse on foot. At its peak from about 1050 to 1200 AD in the Mississippian period, Cahokia was larger than the medieval city of London, and its record as the most densely populated city in America would have held up until about the early 1800s, when the growing city of New York would have finally surpassed it. So quite a stretch of time there. Cahokia itself contained about at least 120 mounds, 80 of which we know still exist today. If you ask John Kelly, there's probably more. And the people who lived there were not only these incredible engineers, but also these truly spectacular artisans creating beautiful objects out of stone, clay, shell, and copper. The ceremonial core of Cahokia spans about 16 square miles, and also the site itself probably extends at least 10 miles from that central core even. As a paramount political and religious center, Cahokia drew in locals, far-reaching, far-traveling immigrants and pilgrims alike. The densely populated city is thought to have supported specialized artisans and craftspeople, practices that are probably very deeply entangled in ritual and religious beliefs themselves. And beyond the city's ceremonial core, dispersed rural communities may have been integrated, in part at least, to Cahokia's kind of political religious movement through communal religious and political gatherings. Now, the decline of Cahokia was evident by roughly about AD 1200, with a continual fall in regional population until the paramount center is considered to have collapsed and been largely abandoned by about AD 1350. So for my purposes here, I'm going to be referring to this period of like decline and abandonment broadly as the late Mississippian, as the strong division between these phases, Moorhead and Sand Prairie, are a little mucky and debated. And for my purposes, I'm kind of looking at both of these in combination. But overall, this time span of the late Mississippian between 13th and 14th centuries is considered a time of very dramatic population decline and the decentralization and collapse of Cahokia as this major regional center. But what do I actually mean by collapse? Collapse is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot colloquially, but when we start putting it in an archaeological or even just a historical context, we really have to kind of poke at what we are trying to get at by this word. Okay, so let's sit with this word for a second, collapse. When I say this word, what sorts of images come to mind? How are people responding to or engaging with collapse? Where do people go? What are they doing? Now, most likely, a few of you kind of thinking about this word, some of these pretty dramatic images might come to mind, filled with disaster, chaos, and the disappearance or even death of a lot of people. It's sometimes hard not to let these sorts of images and ideas define our notion of what collapse inherently entails. Specifically when a lot of public media tends to lean into the dramatic or the extreme. Some authors, like Jared Diamond, have set collapse as this kind of ultimate determination of a society's overall success or their own inability and failure to maintain order. Archaeologists haven't necessarily historically done the best job about complicating this notion of collapse, at least in a very publicly accessible and engaging way. We tend to kind of write within our own circles, right? However, very rarely is collapse, as I'm conceptualizing it here for my project, actually resulting in the disappearance or the death of people or even culture, right? This is something I want to return to at the end of my talk tonight, specifically in reference to how Cahokia seems to sometimes be presented in these collapse conversations. So for my specific purposes here, just make sure we get a good view of that. I'm choosing to define collapse as an inherently political process, where a political entity and its various kind of like associated networks or institutions fragment and fall apart. There is no singular model of how this may happen or cause for why this really takes place, as each instance is going to be, kind of inherently based on the specific historical setting and context and history that is taking place within. Cahokia's collapse and ancient Rome's collapse, while we might find similarities between them, sure, are ultimately their own unique experiences that we kind of have to consider for, their historical context that we're finding them in. Now, contrary to what a lot of these, again, popular media narratives suggest, outside of these truly catastrophic, extreme examples such as Pompeii, people don't just disappear or die off. The actual experience of collapse is hardly a binary of success or failure, as some folks, again, like kind of Jared Diamond, might suggest. Admittedly, things are a lot more complicated than that, and honestly kind of more interesting than that. This perspective differs that I'm adopting from an inherently kind of cultural or even societal collapse that, again, implies this complete disappearance of people and or culture. Rather, when we think about collapse through a political lens, we can kind of begin to question how the decentralization of things that are all kind of like entwined, like economic networks or religious practices, might actually be affected during these moments. I do think the word collapse is useful, particularly in talking to public audiences. We just have to be kind of careful and specific about what we mean by it. But back to the American bottom, just how and why did Cahokia specifically collapse as a major regional polity? Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, there is no general consensus on why Cahokia, a far-reaching and powerful political entity as it was, ceased to be. When the Interpretive Center at Cahokia was opened, you used to be able to vote on your favorite theory of collapse, which of many theories you liked best by sliding $1 into a respective donation bin. I always love to see that at the end when I visited. But the most popular theories generally are surrounding these notions of environmental disruption, warfare, factionalization, flooding, people just not getting along, or just like a general dissolution or decline of, I guess, buy-in, so to speak, with the leaders of Cahokia and kind of their broader elite network. These are some of the most popular theories. Now, most likely, there is no single contributing factor to Cahokia's collapse, but rather it's probably a lot more murky and multi-layered than that. But admittedly, I'm not super interested right now, at least, in trying to determine the why of Cahokia's collapse, or even really interested necessarily in examining Cahokia's collapse at Cahokia proper. Rather, I am really interested in questioning Cahokia's collapse beyond the boundary of the city, its central ceremonial core, and even its suburbs. We know that as Cahokia was primarily abandoned, groups dispersed into the broader southeast and midwest, while a few scattered folks seem to stay at Cahokia, just not necessarily very tightly woven. It seems other isolated farmsteads and rural households remained scattered around the countryside, while Oneota groups seem to have moved in from the north, taking some shorter-term settlements. Now, these rural households and homesteads that either kind of persisted through Cahokia's abandonment or at least chose to stay for a time kind of at the tail end of the polity are where I'm choosing to put my research focus. In shifting beyond the city limits of Cahokia, I'm using this concept of rurality to really try to highlight how rural peoples had a set of dispositions and practices that differed in some ways, at least, from those of urban dwellers due to these kind of diverse social and physical settings. Now, this isn't to suggest necessarily that there's the strict, again, binary or dichotomy of rural versus urban life, much more complicated than that, but that traditions or identity per se, but rather that there's a value in kind of taking a bottom-up approach that centers rural life, thought, and experience on its own terms and as a necessary basis for kind of understanding these really local processes. So I'm characterizing rurality here as basically a process through which rural localities are socially, materially, and kind of like conceptually constructed, practiced, and experienced by diverse peoples. Rural geographer Keith Haffecree illustrates this concept of rurality with what he terms a threefold model, a visual model of which is kind of shown here, where the lives of rural peoples, a rural landscape itself, rural landscape locality itself, and the ways that rural is kind of represented both physically and mentally all intersect in unique ways depending on the context where you're in to create a unique rurality. Now, there's been a wealth of research I want to acknowledge on earlier rural settlements and the connection to the rise and height of Cahokia as this urban polity, just a few titles I show here. However, it's only been kind of within recent years that it seems there's been a greater focus on kind of these rural settlements dating to the late Mississippian of roughly, again, the 13th and 14th centuries I mentioned before. Now, overall, this last quarter or so of Cahokia's major history is really what we know the least about, particularly this late 14th century, right there at the tail end. Now, even less of this research has been directed on kind of earlier, has been directed in the central floodplain south of Cahokia. A lot of this work has been kind of more in the northern section or out into the rural uplands to the east. So in zooming out from Cahokia's central core, I'm instead trying to set my focus on this area south into the central and southern American bottom here, really to kind of see what that distance is actually saying about rural experience. So everyday differences in my mind between rural and urban settings kind of across this broader landscape might become more pronounced and distinguishable in these moments of broader societal change, such as collapse. The Prairie DuPont Creek and this little map I pulled together, shown here on the right, may have served kind of like as a physical divider, so to speak, between Cahokia and the smaller settlements to the south, effectively sort of lengthening a social distance between the locales and fostering, you know, diverse everyday experiences. This is more perhaps than just an everyday daily trip. All right, now let's think about, I had y'all think about collapse. I want everybody to kind of think about their own everyday lives for a moment. So think about those rhythms and routines that shaped your lived experience, whether, you know, we kind of consciously think of them or not. Your household makeup probably determines a lot of this. Do you have children you're caring for, extended family members? Does your job require a specific schedule that influences when you wake up, when you cook, eat, clean, move around, and sleep? Do you go out for work or do you work from home? Now, these everyday practices are really kind of a central component, whether we kind of realize it or not, of forming our notions of self and our broader social worlds that we live in. Those everyday life practices shifted a good bit for many of us with COVID and working from home, although I don't think that our pets were too upset about that change. Mine wasn't, at least. Now, there are many different kind of components that weave together the patterns of everyday life. I'm not going to go into all those this evening, but I'm choosing now to focus on kind of three main aspects for my project. Anthropologists have long kind of acknowledged and recognized how everyday household foodways, ceramic styles are kind of that very tightly knit material culture, most often involved in foodways and such. And spatial organization and architecture in particular play central roles in the creation and expression of our social identities and worldviews. These materials intersect very nicely, particularly within kind of these more rural domestic contexts, are where I'm really trying to focus a good bit of my work. Previous research in the region has shown that many early rural groups, kind of at the start of Cahokia's growth, selectively adopted new Cahokian lifeways and practices of these specific material types I've referenced, oftentimes hybridizing, them with earlier woodland period traditions. So some examples of that include the construction of a faux wall trench structure that only modeled kind of at the appearance of a Cahokian form, Cahokian-styled structures that were then arranged in a earlier woodland period spatial pattern, and the incorporation of earlier woodland period motifs and such with new Cahokian ceramic types. So if rural peoples are understood to have adopted practices associated with the rise of the Cahokian polity in uneven and kind of unique ways as compared to their urban counterparts, how might that diversity actually manifest during the polity's collapse? So with this framework in mind, the primary question guiding so much of my research is to really examine how rural peoples actually engage in their everyday lives with the collapse of political systems. Now, to answer this much bigger question, I've got three slightly more bite-sized questions that directly relate back to those material types surrounding foodways, ceramic technology, and household construction and kind of spatial organization that I mentioned before. The first, what do food remains and ceramic vessels indicate about rural household foodways? How did everyday notions of household social identity and worldview potentially shift during this time as seen through ceramic style and form? And then finally, how did household social organization, autonomy, and even potentially economic production shift or persist as seen through settlement patterns and kind of dwelling layout? Now, to answer these questions, I'm examining previously excavated archaeological material from several late Mississippian sites in the Central American bottom floodplain. I'll mention a few of those later this evening in the talk. But I'm also conducting excavations new excavations at the Hawkins Hollow Site. I'm going to be focusing for the remainder of the talk this evening on Hawkins Hollow and our ongoing work there. Now, Hawkins Hollow, shown here, nestled quite lovely against the bluffs, is a pre-contact Native North American site located in the floodplain just outside of the modern village of VALMEYER in western Monroe County. While the site was first noted in the 1990s, 1990, I think precisely, extensive research was only really called for when a new roadway was proposed as kind of a northern access route for the village of VALMEYER once it was relocated to an upland setting south of the site as a result of the Great Flood of 1993, a photo of which I've shared here on the right. I think we're in like kind of the 30-year anniversary of that, actually. I think the floods kind of started around April or so. So as you can see here in the map on the left, Hawkins Hollow is located fairly far south of Cahokia proper, about 41 kilometers or 25 something miles as the crow flies. So when the proposed new access road from the floodplain into the uplands was first kind of going through, the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, or ISAS, conducted phase 1 through 3 mitigation to kind of assess the potential archaeological features that might be impacted by that upcoming construction. Here, I've shown just an aerial photo of the rough kind of known limits of the Hawkins Hollow site on the left, just to kind of spatially orient us. That's the road that went in, and 2 very large cornfields. On the right is a LiDAR overlay of ISAS's phase 1 survey showing different surface material distributions. And in particular, ISAS personnel noted a strong density of surface materials along the north of the stream channel kind of coming through here. And shown circled here is a part of a controlled surface collection grid that they implemented where there was really this very strong density of material coming through that would be impacted by the road. Now, while opening up several test excavation blocks in 1996, two main cultural features were exposed by ISS personnel. These included feature 1, a late Mississippian sand prairie phase, and kind of 14th century structure shown here in orange, and feature 2, an associated midden right outside. Now, I don't have, unfortunately, time this evening to kind of go into complete detail on the findings concerning these two main features, but I'm going to hit a few highlights, in particular surrounding the structure, to kind of help contextualize what we have been finding this season and how these findings and earlier research has guided me as I've been approaching my dissertation. So feature 1, the structure, consisted of 2 known occupations. The plan map of the first earlier occupation shown here. Now, we don't have a complete understanding of the occupation's overall size and basin limits, as the edges of the basin were later kind of obliterated by the later occupation going over the top of it. But we can, what ISS was able to parse out was that the overall interior floor area for the structure is just under about 51 square meters, which is fairly large as compared to other sites of the same time and rural locality. In terms of artifacts, this first occupation contained pretty abundant evidence of kind of general chert reduction or flint knapping activities and the production of very fine microliths. Occupation 1 seems to have ended with a planned deconstruction and decision to rebuild the structure, possibly after about 10 to 15 years. And occupation 2. Occupation 2 of the structure is a bit more complex and kind of really what is influencing a good bit of some of my initial interpretations of new excavations at Hawkins Hollow. So as I say, it's a bit more complex, namely in the greater overall density of artifacts recovered, as well as the distinctive signs of the structure being subjected to an intense fire, the burned logs resulting from which you can see on the left here. So there's some patterning evidence of features internal to the structure based on this plan map that suggests they were kind of taking into consideration the earlier arrangement of things from occupation 1, particularly with kind of like a low area of artifact density in the northwest corner. Maybe that's like a low activity area or even a sleeping area. But really, again, the most notable aspect of feature 1 in the second occupation is the spatial extent of the structure itself. In plan view, again, pictured here to the right, the basin limits encompass an area of roughly about 9 1/4 by 8 by 6 or so. So it's about 80 meters or so. This is very large in comparison to nearly all other Mississippian structures thus far, I should say, encountered in small rural sites in the American bottom. Now, the material assemblages of the 2 occupations differ in density, as I mentioned. With occupation 2, this burned one containing, much more debris in general, much more artifacts in general, but specifically greater quantities of ceramics, especially rim sherds, which I am distinctly lacking so far this season, and as well as still numerous large lithic tools such as celts, and intense evidence of microlith production, possibly for making shell beads and such. Now, bringing this all together in terms of interpretation, these previous excavations revealed a number of unique aspects of the Hawkins Hollow site. As I mentioned before, the overall structure size is quite large, even as we anticipate that structures around this late Mississippian time are kind of getting larger and larger gradually from the earlier Mississippian into this later phase. Now, this large site and kind of the unique composition of microliths and tools, as well as a lot of serving vessels rather than jars, possibly suggests that this wasn't necessarily a common or single, just a domestic structure perhaps, but rather that it might have been used in some capacity by rural elites or used for shell bead making, that potentially this was something unique, even by a rural standard. It's been suggested that rather than, again, this kind of domestic structure, it may have been used as a special purpose men's house, potentially. It's a little hard to say. And the fire has been interpreted perhaps as an unplanned catastrophic event based on just like this different sorts of materials and placements in which they're found. But what really caught my attention about this site, as I'm kind of like assessing what the heck my dissertation is going to be about, but what really caught my attention about this site and its associated report was that the authors note how, in all reality, a really confident interpretation of this site is quite challenging. As one, we don't have a great basis of comparison due to the overall low number of analyzed late Mississippian, specifically really sand prairie phase sites in the region. And two, this project was only reasonably so focused on the area to be impacted by road construction. Doug Jackson, as co-authors for this report, suggests that in all likelihood there may have been other cultural features at the site that could really help in this interpretation. It's really challenging, to kind of see the big picture without all the information of associated potential structures or other dwelling features at the site. So this kind of initial, maybe this, but we're unsure conclusion led me to properly resurvey the site as part of my dissertation research to kind of assess whether additional cultural features really might be present. So last November, myself and Dr. Tim Horsley of Horsley Archaeological Prospection conducted a roughly 3-acre gradiometer survey over the Hawkins Hollow Site. Our goal in the survey was to assess the presence of other potential, like I said, cultural features beyond where ISAS was able to focus in the course of their own mitigation work. And from the survey, we noted several potential areas of interest, but really zeroed in on one area in particular here in the southernmost field. Now, this anomaly seemed to measure about 4 by 6 meters in size and was roughly the size, shape, and signature we might expect for a later Mississippian structure. So for my preliminary pilot field season, this is where I've really been focusing my efforts. Now, namely, we've set to kind of uncovering the entire basin expanse of the suspected structure, hoping to really define the overall orientation and architecture well. Now, we indeed found a structure, but really quickly kind of ran into the challenging aspect of encountering a quite shallow plow zone, measuring in at only about an average of like 22 to 25 at its max below the surface, and a very shallow basin, with the basin fill being only about a few centimeters deep as well, very thin. So in initially kind of coming through the plow zone, it was a little difficult to distinguish this very thin division between the plow, sterile soils, and the basin, due in large part to the shallowness of this, and the plow really kind of tearing up some of the edges of the topmost sections and the southern half in particular of the structure. This basin fill was so thin that we really didn't catch it in profile at first or recognize it as such until we had expanded outward and captured an intact and very crisp, nice basin line. What was very abundantly evident was how quickly parts of a burned structure floor were popping through that very ephemeral thin basin fill. Now, just this morning, we were actually able to finally get a decent clean trowel over the entirety of the basin to see those edges lining up quite nicely. This is by no means our final photograph, I want to clarify, as we're still going to work on getting a higher upper aerial shot. We had some issues with the drone this morning, it's all good. And some photogrammetry shots in as well. But you can see kind of the rough edges of the basin coming together here with those strong areas of a burned floor popping through as well. This is, again, as you can imagine, particularly exciting that it's burned, and the other occupation on the other side of the road was also burned. I was very excited. In terms of artifacts we recovered from the plow zone and the very most intermix of this basin fill, we have gotten a whole lot of lithics, namely flakes, but also several microliths, microlithic blades, a drill and other tools that are reminiscent of those found in the earlier ISAS excavations of the separate structure. We just found another point this morning. These aren't the most formal photos, again, artifact photos, especially in my dang hand, but the in-the-moment field photos that you send to your parents seem to be the most exciting. Now on the right is pictured a local avocationalist of Museum Society, John Milkert, who has been joining us for the majority of the season and has been an insane help, proudly holding an adze he found. He's really one of the crew now. I want to give him a shout out. We're very lucky to have his handyman skills fixing flyaway canopies and broken sprayers. We've only had a few very small pieces of pottery coming through so far, most quite friable and non-diagnostic, so they're essentially breaking almost as soon as we're getting them out. I'm trying to be quite careful with that, but they are noticeably shell-tempered and kind of very reassuring that this expected Mississippian roughly date. And some of these arrowheads resembling those finer kind of Cahokian styles, but a little bit more, I hate the word crude, but using the word crude, are also kind of often found in some of these later Mississippian sites. From the MAG survey we conducted, we likewise identified a number of potential pit anomalies, such as the one shown here circled. There we go. This circular anomaly was expected to measure about 1 meter in diameter. Just taking my time here. So we popped open a quick little 1x1 unit over it to assess that. And we did indeed come on top of a strong concentration of charcoal-rich fill in that 1x1 just below plow zone, very nice and neat, except, however, that the potential pit edges were not very clear. So hoping to kind of catch those edges, we expanded out. The long story short is that, well, the fill just hasn't ended. We've expanded out to a 1x3 now. And are still not seeing the edges of whatever this is kind of going on. Rather, we've got kind of one stronger pocket of charcoal and some burning coming through there in the center towards the north wall. And the fill seems to just kind of continue currently out to unknown lengths. Now, whether this is a midden of some type or even a basin that didn't register on the MAG, it's hard to say at the moment. I will say that this area is considerably more clayey than the silty loam we've kind of encountered at the burn structure, and almost no material coming out of it so far. We're really still very much at the top of it in the plow zone, but really no material is coming out of it whatsoever, except for these little itty-bitty bits of charcoal kind of distinguishing it as fill. But rather than try to chase this out by opening any more units at the moment for the 1 week left of excavations that we have, our current plan is just to do a little bit of coring to prospect out its potential dimensions as well as its depth, and that's going to be a future autumn problem. We're actually going to be aided in some of this coring by several Boy Scouts in this task this weekend as we host a Archaeology Merit Badge Day at Camp Vandevenner right outside of Waterloo. So like I said, we've got just about a week of excavations left to go this season at Hawkins Hollow, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself too much in terms of interpretations just yet, particularly as we have not yet gotten our final basin profile yet, or even really exposed the structure floor in its entirety. It's going to be really interesting to see how the structure compares to the earlier one identified by ISAS personnel, particularly when you consider that our, at most, 5 centimeter thick basin fill as compared to the other structures, 50 centimeter thick basin fill. So our current plan is kind of to just take a subsample of the current basin fill that we've exposed for flotation of potential food remains and such. This will give me kind of a good initial start on some initial analyses and argue for funding. And likewise, start getting some good profile views of this basin as well to kind of assess those dimensions and orientation. My hope is to return to the site in the very near future, all intents to do so, whether later this year after harvest or next spring, summer, and continue forward with this entire removal of the basin fill and proper exposure of the structure floor in its entirety for mapping. I'm looking into the possibility as well of kind of getting, seeking out funding for micromorph samples so we can start really seeing hopefully a clear understanding of the transition between the forest development, this moment of burning, and the basin fill as well. We're likewise hoping, as I said, to do a bit of coring this weekend with our Boy Scouts to kind of assess how the magnetometry results are matching up to the actual presence of feature fill in some areas outside of the structure as well, where some other potential anomalies might be popping up. So in terms of future directions, I have certainly got plenty to work with, both in terms of continuing at Hawkins Hollow and beyond. So many of these late Mississippian sites, we do know they exist. Oftentimes the information about them are just reserved to unanalyzed collections or kind of this gray literature that hasn't been quite published or written up and shared yet. So my current plan, again, is to return into the future or even next summer to really finish out this work at the burn structure and other potential areas of interest. And I'm hoping to do some survey work at other nearby suspected late Mississippian sites, such as Schaefer or Fanaya, shown here, just kind of south of Hawkins Hollow, to kind of really assess whether they might actually be late Mississippian, at least in some component, as has been suggested in a few lines of gray literature that I've caught. Likewise, I'm currently in the process of analyzing existing collections from a number of these sites, collected kind of either in the 1970s in the course of historic survey work, or donated to ISAS offices on the part of local applicationalists that have oftentimes collected at these sites. So I want to close my little talk tonight by reflecting a little bit on specifically Cahokia's collapse, and specifically, as I mentioned before and has been discussed, how it is being portrayed in public medias and in news articles. As I mentioned before, collapse is one of these big buzzwords, right? That's very engaging and attention-catching, but it often gets kind of thrown around without, kind of further questioning of what we actually mean by it. Cahokia, as shown in some of these major news headlines, has often been used as kind of this grandiose example that perpetuates sometimes a totalizing and at times disastrous depiction of the polity's demise. We're definitely, complicating that with additional research, but some of these words, as far as like doomed and such, don't be the next Cahokia, is like a warning, perpetuate. So in kind of, thinking about how this often is perpetuated as like a totalizing and disastrous depiction of the polity's demise. So in kind of refusing to complicate these terms that will continue to be accessible and used by a broader public audience that we engage with, I think the archaeologists sometimes run the risk of allowing this perpetuation of inaccurate and sometimes harmful narratives to persist, such as like this kind of notion of the vanishing Indian, right? So it's my hope that this research can kind of expand the story of Cahokia's collapse beyond the borders of the urban site itself and complicate these collapse narratives by really placing an emphasis on the diverse roles of rural peoples at these pivotal moments who at times are staying even through collapse. So by treating rural spaces as social centers in their own right, with distinctive peoples and potentially traditions, I really hope that my research will go on to help illuminate the story of those who have kind of long been relegated a little bit to Cahokia's shadow in some parts. I hope to contribute to a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of what we mean by collapse that actually allows for multiple trajectories of change, persistence, and presence, that takes an approach that places a lot more emphasis and importance on life's sort of ephemeral traces that are often overlooked. Thank you all so much for your time and attention this evening. And again, a sincere thanks to my crew who I've listed here, my field crew. I could not have done this at all without any of y'all. And yeah, I'm just very thankful for this opportunity. Thank you so much. Oh, I will say, if you are interested in following along with project updates, whether this season, next, the following analyses that I'm doing, we have a project social media pages. On Facebook, we are SAB, Southern American Bottom, .archaeo, archaeology was already taken. and Instagram, sab.archaeology. You can follow us on there. I have business cards if people are interested in those as well. I have it all labeled out there. So thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes. Yes, please.
I'm actually a couple.
Okay.
Were the structures burned on purpose?
So that's a great question. So the initial ISAS interpretation of the burn structure let's see if I can do this. Yeah, there we go. That the initial occupation 2 that they encountered, they kind of hedged their bets a little bit that it could have burned intentionally or it might have been accidental. There have been more kind of recent studies of this. Let's see if I can get back to it. Kind of looking at this broader tradition of fire used as a very powerful potential closer of either materials or places, particularly as, you're thinking about kind of leaving a space. So it's hard to say right now in terms of like what just this initial kind of results from ISAS. They kind of concluded that they think it was unintentional. I'm not so sure. I think that there's more evidence, particularly in this late Mississippian period, that fire is being used quite intentionally as a very powerful closer of places as folks are leaving. We see evidence of this at some other late Mississippian sites. Aaron Benson has looked at this along with several other folks. And something that I think is interesting that we might hopefully be getting into once we start seeing our own structure floor pop up a little bit more as we continue excavations is right now we're not seeing any burned timbers really popping up along the edges of the structure that we're uncovering, which might suggest that they deconstructed the structure, kind of piled everything there in the center, and then set it ablaze. Kind of potentially very intentionally using a strong, powerful element such as fire to close, stop, and release a place before they moved on.
My other question was, could you show us on the map where Hawkins Hollow is in relationship to the Poultry site?
Yes.
I know where that is. I'm trying to picture where.
Yeah, let's see. Absolutely. Got it here. A little slow. We're getting there. Oh, I thought it was this one. Hold on. I'm getting there. So Poultry is north of Hawkins Hollow. Not too far. We are just south of Washhausen as well. But Poultry, if it's right there on the, I thought this was a map. Sorry. I thought I had more maps in this. I think they're at the tail end, of course. So if Poultry is right there kind of at the border, here we go, St. Clair and Monroe County. Just got to go down south into the floodplain a little bit, right there with Hawkins Hollow with Washhausen, right there in between us.
Just north of the New Valmeyer.
That's correct, yep. So quite literally, if you take Woodland Ridge Road that, so if you're coming kind of along southward along Bluff Road, take Woodland Ridge, which is the access road that they put in, you're in Valmeyer in 3 minutes. So it's directly nested right there up along the bluffs, heading up north.
One question.
Yes.
What kind of work has been done about the same distance north of Cahokia?
North of Cahokia? That's a great question. So a lot of this work, Tom Emerson and others have kind of done, particularly again, kind of earlier stuff. There are some folks kind of looking into, Greg Wilson and others kind of looking into kind of the central Illinois River Valley as well, and some of this kind of northeastern uplands as well. Like I mentioned, Erin Benson, she has done, with ISAS, has done a good bit of this research with her recent dissertation in 2020. Again, kind of looking and exploring this idea of how rural peoples beyond Cahokia are starting to engage with it. And what she and some others are really emphasizing is there's no one model of it. There's no one way to be rural. It is seeming that whether it is in part that rural peoples have kind of always done their own thing, or as these potential, centralized networks of Cahokian influence and communication are, crumbling a little bit, so to speak, that each different kind of communities, however those like kind of spatial limits actually exist, is kind of doing their own thing. This notion of a kind of a Cahokian identity is shifting, it seems, up in this area. So that'll be really interesting to kind of use as a comparison in conversation with what might be kind of occurring in the southern area. It's particularly interesting to see how that compares, as we know that there have been some kind of later woodland or kind of early Mississippian differences between these north and central sections, as we start kind of thinking about like culture tradition of ceramics and such, as compared to these more northern sections. These, again, kind of very early differences that might translate into later times as well.
Weren't there a lot of movement out of Cahokia to the bluff to get higher ground?
That is one interpretation, to be sure. I think that overall we can just for sure be thinking that folks are absolutely moving out, definitely some eastward. I honestly think more likely people are kind of moving everywhere out, whether it's kind of further west and across the other side of the Mississippi, or up into the uplands, whether it's for flood purposes or something else going on. Couple questions. I saw Gail's hand first, and then we'll keep going. Yeah, Gail.
Thank you so much, Autumn. It's so exciting to be treated to breaking news from the field like today, this morning. Down today.
Thank you.
But you mentioned Prairie du Pont Creek as a possible sort of dividing line.
Yes.
It reminded me of the Oneota site, the tree farm, and all that kind of stuff. So, and the burning, I wonder if conflict feeds into your thinking at this point.
It's something that I'm kind of exploring. Conflict has been one of those points that is always, like I said, kind of in these like headlines of like, why did Cahokia start kind of crumbling? I'm kind of at the point where I'm, again, not super interested in explaining necessarily just yet why all of these things happened, but let's look at kind of what is materializing first and then how that connects to these different potential options and overlaying options. But with the Oneota, I do think it starts getting kind of complicated as we think about these rural groups who are probably in all likelihood interacting with some of these different communities coming in, whether they are longer term settlements or kind of very short instances as well.
Do you have radiocarbon dates? Did ISAS get radiocarbon dates for Hawkins Hollow?
For Hawkins Hollow, they are. So there's a few issues in the radiocarbon dates where there's a couple like fluctuations. And I'm going to butcher the exact reasoning, but essentially some aspect with like either flares or things like that that are kind of messing with the very precision of the dates, but they are getting kind of that between like 1320s or so, plus or minus a little bit. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the exact contemporaneity with specifically the Oneota that we're starting to kind of see, because right here around like Altes and Fultz and such, around that Maystown area, we start definitely knowing that we have Oneota settlements possibly coming up there. But I'm definitely hoping to start trying to refine some of those dates as well. The more dates you have, I mean, I'm hoping that it will kind of provide that better clarity for having these things in conversation. Yeah. Thank you, Gil.
Talk about rural settlements makes me think about Emerald Mound by Linden, Illinois, which is not been determined to be a settlement, but a shrine and a pilgrimage site.
Potentially, yeah.
Heading towards Cahokia. And Susan Alt and Timothy talked that they found a trail across Silver Creek, maybe through aerial photographs or something.
That seems familiar, like some of Rebecca's work.
How can they differentiate that to be so specific that and not be a rural settlement like you're finding? I just wonder how they, I know that they found layers of color on the floors of the structures. And moist water, anyway. Just curious as to the differentiation between the two.
In terms of like kind of what's rural and what's not rural, is that the question?
Rural and what's a shrine?
What's rural and what's a shrine? So again, I think that
Do you have any indications of any kind of shrine or lack of pit in your site to indicate that was a short time, just used for a very short time?
Right. No, that's a good question. So I think that honestly I need to do more work at the site, especially kind of prospecting outside of the structure itself. We haven't removed the burned floor to know if there's like any like internal pits or things like that. Based on the current ISAS evidence, there's no super strong indication in terms of shrines necessarily, other than, again, this very large aspect of the structure. They are getting like some potential red cedar coming through to where there's kind of like this hemming and hawing of like, was this used in kind of a ceremonial purpose? Is this more than like what domestic kind of we consider domestic to be? In terms of kind of thinking like what makes rural versus what makes a shrine, I don't think that's necessarily like a dichotomy in that way. There can be rural shrines. And I also think that kind of in questioning what is rural, it's all a little bit in perspective in terms of, you know, rural to who and for whom. For Emerald in particular, you know, I think that in considering the practice of mound building and monumentality is also kind of something that we need to consider how this plays into a role, because we know that like there are, you know, it's not necessarily that rural peoples are separated in every aspect from this broader social world. It's just that the social and physical distance between some of these places might be really meaningful in terms of like how they're actually presenting themselves and seeing themselves in that moment. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
You also have the celestial.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're good. That's great. Yeah, there's a lot there. I am interested, I think it'll be really interesting to kind of see and compare some of these structural alignments and things like that, you know, thinking about an overall dwelling space rather than just like the boundaries of a structure itself. What is actually a dwelling in terms of how you move throughout a landscape rather than just the boundaries of a walls? Whether it's the place that you sleep or it's the place that you cook or it's the workshop that you're making fine materials in. Are these people actually separated from this broader kind of like larger economic network? Are they doing their own thing and making, you know, shell beads or these very fine tools even kind of at the tail end of Cahokia as this major polity? So I'm really hoping to keep toying through the mag a little bit and some prospecting to really get an overall thought of what does this actual layout beyond just the walls of a structure actually tell us about how people are choosing to organize themselves in that moment. And is there like actually any patterns to, you know, as a comparative basis, or are people really just kind of doing their own thing? Oh, thank you.
With your
Thank you.
remote sensing survey, is it see any other indications where other structures might be on the site?
So that is my bane right now, I will say. Let's come back to this. Let's see if I can pull this up. I in no way, put it on record, want to claim that I am an expert in magnetometry. I hired Tim Horsley for this, and he and I are in conversation to start interpreting some of these things a little bit better, both in terms of my timeline, because dissertations don't wait for COVID, unfortunately, whether you are allowed 2 years of doing nothing but reading and writing. So kind of mine and Tim's right now is, I got the structure. Let's focus on the structure, and then we'll start talking big picture. But we definitely do have some of these other potential things kind of coming up, different other pit anomalies, pitty anomalies coming up. This is the area here you can see kind of blown out of ISAS's earlier excavations. So if we are here just kind of directly in line right there, kind of the under layer, there's that controlled surface collection there. They leave a lot of metal behind, I've noticed. But I think this area, my landowner told me, was like a controlled burn pretty recently. All this kind of blowout, I'd call blowout, but basically this is like a paleo channel kind of coming through where the creek manifested historically. You can see these nice little plow lines where the tractor turned around. But there are still, and I wish I had a better kind of zoomed in photo here, but there are still some areas that I would really like to hopefully prospect around and try to ground truth, so to speak, to see really what's going on. Because, you know, these late Mississippian sites, I think Tim was, I hope you know, he doesn't kill me for saying this. I think he was a little disappointed when he first did the mag here, because he's worked previously at Poultry and Washhausen, where you can't like swing a sandbag without hitting a house basin, especially at Poultry. And he's doing all this over 3 acres in very cold November weather, and he's like, there's nothing there. And I think it's just kind of like slowing down, hopefully he and I together soon, and kind of poking through and really fine-tune looking at what might be there that just doesn't look like some of this earlier stuff that we do know manifests, like those really nice little neat house basins. One of my crewmates and I have just kind of been poking around at this for the last couple days in QGIS, and there's some kind of like little circular thing going on out here that when we were trying to find the edge of the basin, I was coring out far beyond what I knew the structure was. I'm like, I'm going to hit sterile, and I'm just going to walk in and find this dang edge so that we, you know, are spending a better use of our time. So I walked like 5 meters out, and I'm like, I'm just going to start here, go in some increments. First core I do, I hit some kind of cultural fill. I'm like, well, dang it. I don't know what this is, but it's not the basin unless it's massive, which we had no indication that it was that big, or I couldn't tell you. So that's, again, I think there's a lot more work to be done here to kind of complicate, you know, what actually does a late site look like? Is there, you know, kind of this expected model that we can follow, or does it all kind of manifest a little uniquely just based on where you're at and who, you know, these communities, because these are communities in their own right, are engaging with and doing? Are they, you know, kind of doing their own ceremonial things once Cahokia and rural elites might not necessarily be the ones kind of influencing or controlling that? I don't have the answers for that just yet, but I'm hoping between some of these different collections I'm analyzing and just future work here at the structure and hypothetically beyond, because again, that's going to haunt me in my dreams right now of what the heck this is, to start really answering some of those questions. I think there's a fair amount of work. He and I were like, that kind of looks like a square. Squares don't happen naturally. So yeah, it's a long-winded answer to fingers crossed, I think. So yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
All right, thank you very much.
Oh, do we have some? No, that's totally fine. Okay.
This site is contemporary to like Dixon and Autumn,
Ooh, I don't think so, but don't quote me on that. If these are contemporary with Dixon and what was the other one? I could not tell you off the top of my head. I'm not familiar with that one. I'm going to go look it up after this talk now, though, for sure. Was there any others? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate these questions. They got me thinking as well, so thank you for your time.